Emily Harper, a quiet factory worker, defies her strict supervisor Mason by sharing her sandwich with a hungry boy Tyler at Eagle Line Steel. Reprimanded for breaking security protocols, Emily faces a written warning. That evening, 3 Marines visit her home, revealing Tyler is the nephew of Colonel Mark Connelly. Her small act of kindness helped Tyler find safety, prompting the Marines to confront the factory's management. As whispers spread and tensions rise, Emily's simple gesture sparks unexpected consequences. What will the Marines' visit uncover, and how will it change Emily's life forever? Stay tuned to find out. Subscribe now to hear more heartwarming tales like Emily's. Hit like to honor everyday heroes, share to spread their stories, and comment with your own acts of kindness. Support our channel and make a difference today. The November wind sliced through the employee break area at Eagle Line Steel Manufacturing, a sprawling factory nestled in a quiet Pennsylvania town. Emily Harper, 27, tugged her threadbare jacket closer, her breath forming faint clouds in the frigid air. Neither the youngest nor the oldest worker on the assembly line, Emily was a ghost among her peers, soft-spoken, unassuming, and perpetually overlooked. Orphaned by her mother's untimely death years ago, she carried the weight of caring for her aging father and younger sister in their modest home, a mere 10 blocks from the factory's looming smokestacks. Each dawn, she rose at 5:00 a.m., her hands deftly assembling lunches, simple but hearty sandwiches for herself and often her father, who toiled at the local hardware store. To her co-workers, Emily was the woman with homemade meals, always offering a gentle smile or a kind word, yet steering clear of the factory's ceaseless gossip. 5 years on the job, her perfect attendance record and quiet diligence made her invisible to most, except to Supervisor Mason, a man in his 50s, whose perpetually soured demeanor seemed fueled by anything that strayed from his rigid sense of order. 15 minutes for lunch, people, Mason barked as workers shuffled into the outdoor break area, a grim space shielded by a corrugated metal roof. Big order to finish, so don't dawdle. The workers clustered at weathered metal tables, their breaths mingling with the chill as a light drizzle began to fall, sharpening the bite of the November cold. Emily settled at her usual spot, unwrapping her turkey and cheese sandwich, slathered with her homemade mayo, and pouring steaming soup from her thermos. The warmth of the meal was a small comfort against the gray, damp world around her. Then her eyes caught movement beyond the chain-link fence that bordered the break area, separating it from the desolate lot behind the factory. A boy, no older than 10, stood there, his frail frame swallowed by a soaked, tattered jacket. His sneakers were caked with mud, sinking slightly into the wet earth. But it was his eyes that seized Emily's heart. Red-rimmed, hollow, and fixed not on the workers, but on their food. He didn't beg or call out. He simply stood, one hand pressed against his stomach, his body trembling in the drizzle. Emily's chest tightened, a pang of empathy swelling within her. She knew that look, not just hunger, but the quiet despair of someone who'd learned to expect nothing from the world. "Hey, no loitering!" Mason's voice shattered the low hum of lunchtime chatter. "This is private property." The boy flinched, his small body tensing. But he didn't flee. Mason strode toward the fence, his clipboard waving like a weapon. "No begging here, kid. Move it, or I'm calling the cops." The workers' eyes dropped to their meals, their silence a shield against Mason's wrath. No one dared challenge him. His grudges were legendary, his authority absolute. Emily watched the boy's shoulders slump, his gaze falling to the ground. Her heart twisted painfully. She couldn't look away. Without a word, she tore a napkin from her lunch bag and wrapped half her sandwich, her movements deliberate but cautious. Glancing around to ensure Mason was distracted, his head bent over his clipboard, she rose and walked casually toward the fence. Near the boy, on a soggy cardboard box, she placed the sandwich, her fingers lingering for a moment as if to will him to take it. She didn't meet his eyes, not wanting to draw attention, but she felt his gaze shift to her. "What are you doing?" Diane, a coworker seated nearby, hissed under her breath. "You know Mason's got that rule about vagrants?" "You'll get written up, Emily." Diane's voice was laced with equal parts concern and exasperation, her eyes darting nervously toward Mason. Emily shrugged, her voice soft but steady. "He's freezing. He's starving. A sandwich isn't going to hurt anyone." Inside, though, her pulse quickened. She knew the risk. Mason's rules were ironclad, and defying them could cost her. But the boy's hollow eyes lingered in her mind, a silent plea she couldn't ignore. Your funeral, Diane muttered, turning back to her lunch with a shake of her head. The boy hadn't moved toward the sandwich, his eyes now locked on Emily with a wary flicker of hope, as if he couldn't believe the gesture was real. Emily offered a small nod, a quiet encouragement, before turning back to her table. Her heart thudded with a mix of fear and resolve. She'd done what felt right. Consequences be damned. She'd barely taken 3 steps when Mason's voice thundered behind her. Harper, what do you think you're doing? Emily froze, her stomach lurching as Mason stormed past her toward the fence. His sharp eyes spotted the napkin-wrapped sandwich, and he snatched it up, holding it aloft like evidence of a crime. We have rules here, he snapped, his voice dripping with disdain. You want to feed strays? Do it on your own dime, not during work hours. The break area fell deathly silent. Every worker watched, their faces a mix of curiosity and unease. But no one spoke, Mason's face flushed with anger, his grip tightening on the sandwich. This is company property you're giving away, Harper, and you're encouraging trespassing in a restricted area. With a sneer, he tossed the sandwich to the wet ground, the napkin unraveling in the mud. Emily's breath caught, a flare of indignation rising in her chest. She felt the weight of every pair of eyes on her, the collective tension of her co-workers waiting to see what she'd do. Her hands trembled, but not from fear. Something deeper, a quiet defiance, stirred within her. Without a word, she walked to where the sandwich lay, knelt in the damp grass, and picked it up. Brushing off the mud as best she could, she rewrapped it tightly in the napkin and placed it back on the cardboard box, her movement steady despite the storm brewing around her. Did you hear me, Harper? Mason demanded, his voice a low growl. He stepped closer, looming over her, his clipboard clutched like a shield. Emily rose, her heart pounding but her gaze unwavering. She met his eyes, her voice calm but firm. Yes, sir, I heard you. A beat passed, the air thick with tension. Then softly but with an edge that surprised even herself, she added, and I hear him too. Mason's face darkened, his jaw tightening as the words hung between them. The boy, still silent beyond the fence, watched with wide eyes, his small frame a stark contrast to the confrontation unfolding. Emily's co-workers exchanged glances, some shocked, others uneasy, but none dared intervene. In that moment, Emily felt the weight of her choice, not just the sandwich, but the stand she'd taken. She didn't know who the boy was or why he was there, but she knew one thing: she couldn't turn away from his hunger, his need, no matter what it cost her. That afternoon, Mason summoned Emily to his office, citing a violation of security protocols. The reprimand was sharp, his words laced with warnings about her job's precariousness. But as evening fell, a different kind of reckoning arrived. 3 Marines knocked on Mason's door, their presence heavy with purpose. Who was the boy Mason had dismissed as garbage? And why had his treatment sparked the fury of an entire unit ready to defend his honor? The answers lay in the quiet town of QH, where a single act of kindness had set a chain of events in motion, one that would unravel the truth and change everything. The air in the factory was thick with the hum of machinery and the weight of unspoken tension as Emily Harper returned to her station, her heart still racing from the encounter. The boy's gaze, sharp and unyielding, lingered in her mind like a photograph she couldn't shake. Those eyes, wide with hunger and something grim, something deeper. Perhaps gratitude, perhaps suspicion, had burned into her soul on this frigid November afternoon. She settled back into her work, her hands moving mechanically to assemble parts, but her thoughts were far from the repetitive clank of metal. She replayed the moment she'd handed him half her sandwich, the way his thin fingers had hesitated before accepting it, as if kindness was a foreign currency he didn't trust. She wondered what had driven him to linger near the factory's technical area, a place off limits to outsiders. Had it been desperation, curiosity, or something else entirely? As the hours dragged on, the factory floor felt colder, not from the draft seeping through the high windows, but from the heavy silence that followed her act. Her co-workers, usually chatty during lulls, avoided her gaze, their eyes darting away as if her small rebellion Sharing her lunch with a stranger had marked her as an outcast. Emily felt the sting of their judgment, a quiet accusation that she'd crossed an invisible line. She wasn't naive. She knew the factory's rules were strict, especially near the sensitive technical area. But the boy's hollow cheeks and shivering frame had stirred something in her, a flicker of compassion that refused to be snuffed out by protocol. Still, doubt crept in. Had she been reckless? Had her kindness endangered the security Mason, the supervisor, was always harping about? Her stomach twisted, not from hunger, but from the growing realization that her simple act might carry a heavier price than she'd anticipated. At 3:45 p.m., the intercom crackled to life, its metallic voice slicing through the drone of the factory. Emily Harper to the supervisor's office. The words landed like a stone in her chest. A few coworkers cast fleeting, sympathetic glances her way, their eyes betraying a mix of pity and relief that it wasn't their name called. Emily wiped her grease-stained hands on a shop rag, the rough fabric grounding her for a moment as she steadied her nerves. She wove through the maze of assembly stations, each step toward Mason's glass-walled office, feeling like a march to judgment. The office loomed at the far end of the building, its transparent walls offering no privacy, a constant reminder that Mason's eyes were always on them. She knocked twice on the doorframe, her knuckles barely making a sound. "Come in and close the door," Mason said, his voice flat, his eyes glued to his computer screen. Emily stepped inside, the door clicking shut behind her, sealing her in the small, sterile space. She stood with her hands clasped in front of her posture rigid but her mind racing. What would he say? Would he understand why she'd done it? Or would he see her as just another worker who'd stepped out of line? Mason finally looked up, his face a mask of irritation laced with a faint, smug satisfaction, as if he'd been waiting for this moment to assert his authority. "I've documented today's incident in your personnel file," he said, sliding a form across the desk with deliberate precision. "This is an official written warning for violating company security protocols by engaging with an unauthorized person near the technical area and for insubordination when instructed to cease." Emily's eyes flickered to the form, its stark black text accusing her in cold, bureaucratic language. She made no move to touch it, her hands still clasped tightly, as if letting go would mean surrendering to the unfairness of it all. Mason's voice cut through her thoughts. "Sign at the bottom." His tone was clipped, leaving no room for argument. "And understand that a second violation will result in suspension without pay. A third means termination." The words hung in the air, heavy with finality. Emily's chest tightened, but she forced her hand to move, picking up the pen and scrawling her name at the bottom of the page. As she signed, she felt a quiet defiance simmering beneath her compliance. She hadn't done anything wrong, not really. She'd seen a hungry kid and acted on instinct. Was that so terrible? Mason leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. "You know, Harper, I don't get people like you," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "We have rules for a reason. That kid could have been casing the facility. He could have been a distraction while someone else slipped past security. You think you're helping, but you're putting everyone at risk." Emily's jaw tightened, and before she could stop herself, she murmured, "He was just hungry." Her voice was soft but steady, a quiet challenge to Mason's cold logic. His expression hardened, his lips curling into a thin line. "Next time, take your lunch and go save the world instead of coming to work. We need reliable employees here, not bleeding hearts." The words cut deeper than Emily expected, each syllable a reminder of how little her compassion was valued here. She nodded silently, placed the pen back on the desk with deliberate care, and turned to leave. The weight of the encounter settled over her like a heavy coat as she walked out of the office, her shoulders slumped under the burden of injustice. She hadn't expected praise for sharing her lunch, but a formal warning? It felt like a betrayal, a punishment for daring to see a person instead of a threat. As she changed out of her work clothes in the locker room, the fabric stiff with grease and sweat, she felt the sting of isolation. Her co-workers' silence followed her, their avoidance a reminder that kindness in this place was a liability. Outside, the drizzle had thickened into a steady rain, the kind that soaked through clothes and chilled to the bone. Emily pulled her jacket tighter and began the long walk home, her boots splashing through shallow puddles. She scanned the streets as she walked, her eyes searching for the boy. Where had he gone? Had he found shelter from the worsening weather? The memory of his intense gaze haunted her, a silent question she couldn't answer. She wondered about his story, about the hunger that had driven him to linger near the factory. Was he alone? Did he have a family waiting somewhere? Or was he fending for himself? The uncertainty gnawed at her, mingling with the anger and frustration of Mason's reprimand. At home, Emily moved through her evening routine like a ghost, her body performing tasks while her mind wandered. She helped her father with his medication, measuring out pills with the precision of habit, her hands steady despite the turmoil in her heart. Her father, frail and weathered from months of declining health, watched her with quiet concern as they prepared a simple dinner of soup and bread. Her 16-year-old sister, Lily, chattered about school, oblivious to the storm brewing inside Emily. The warmth of the kitchen, usually a comfort, felt stifling tonight. The clink of dishes and hum of the refrigerator, a stark contrast to the chaos in her mind. She didn't mention the incident at work, not wanting to burden her father with more worry. His health was fragile enough without her adding to his stress. "Emily, you're miles away," her father said as they cleared the dinner dishes, his voice gentle but probing. She managed a faint smile, brushing off his concern. "Rough day," she said, her voice light despite the heaviness in her chest. "Nothing special, just tired." The lie felt necessary, a shield to protect him from her turmoil. She was still scrubbing a stubborn pot when a sharp knock at the front door startled her. She glanced at the clock. 7:30 p.m. Who would visit on a rainy Tuesday evening? "I'll get it," she called, drying her hands on a dish towel as she crossed the small living room. When she opened the door, the sight before her stole her breath. 3 men in crisp Marine Corps uniforms stood at attention, their service caps glistening with rain. The lead Marine, a staff sergeant with a weathered face and eyes that held both authority and warmth, raised his hand in a formal salute. "Miss Emily Harper?" he asked, his voice steady despite the downpour. Emily nodded, her throat tight with confusion. "Staff Sergeant James Reeves, United States Marine Corps," he said, gesturing to the 2 men beside him. "These are Corporals Miller and Diaz. We're here to express our gratitude to you on behalf of our commanding officer and a family in our unit." Emily blinked, her mind scrambling to make sense of his words. "I think there's been a mistake," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know anyone in the Marines." Sergeant Reeves' expression softened, but his tone remained firm. "No mistake, ma'am. May we come in for a moment? We won't take much of your time." Still reeling, Emily stepped aside, her hand trembling as she held the door open. Her father appeared from the living room, his brows raised in silent question. "Dad, these men are from the Marine Corps," she said, her voice unsteady. "They say they want to thank me for something, but I'm not sure what." The 3 Marines stepped into the small entryway, their boots leaving faint, wet marks on the floor. They stood respectfully, their postures rigid but their eyes kind-vein. Sergeant Reeves cleared his throat, his voice steady and deliberate. "Miss Harper, the boy you offered food to today outside the Eagle Line factory is Tyler Connelly, the nephew of Colonel Mark Connelly, who has served with distinction in the Marine Corps for 25 years. Emily's breath caught, her eyes widening as the pieces began to fall into place. The boy, Tyler, hadn't been just a stray kid. He was connected to someone important, someone whose gratitude had brought these men to her doorstep. Her heart pounded as she tried to process the revelation, the weight of the day's events shifting in ways she couldn't yet grasp. The wind howled outside Emily's modest home, carrying a chill that seemed to seep into her very bones as she stood in her living room, heart still racing from the unexpected visit. 3 Marines, Corporal Miller, Sergeant Reeves, and Corporal Diaz, stood before her, their uniforms crisp despite the late hour, their faces etched with a mix of gratitude and solemnity. Emily clutched her sweater tighter, her mind spinning with the weight of what they'd just shared. She had given a sandwich to a boy she'd seen shivering by the fence, a fleeting act of kindness born from instinct. But now she was learning the ripple effects of that simple gesture. Corporal Miller, the youngest of the trio, spoke first, his voice soft but steady, betraying a flicker of emotion. "Yes, ma'am," at the fence, his eyes, still boyish despite his uniform, held a quiet respect as he recounted the story of Tyler, the nephew of Colonel Connelly, their commanding officer. Tyler's mother, Colonel Connelly's sister, had been battling a long, cruel illness, one that had finally claimed her just a week ago. Miller's voice wavered slightly as he described the family's struggle to bring Tyler to the colonel's new post at Camp Lejeune. Legal guardianship paperwork, tangled in bureaucratic knots, had delayed the process, leaving Tyler in the care of a neighbor. Emily's heart sank as she pictured the boy, small, alone, his world upended, staying in a stranger's home while the adults around him tried to piece together his future. Sergeant Reeves picked up the story, his tone measured but heavy with concern. Tyler had slipped away from the neighbor's house the previous morning, vanishing into the cold streets without a word. The neighbor, perhaps overwhelmed or overly optimistic, hadn't reported his absence right away, clinging to the hope that he'd return on his own. It wasn't until dusk that the alarm was raised, and the Marines had been searching tirelessly since. Emily's chest tightened as she imagined Tyler out there, lost in the biting cold, his small frame shivering under a thin jacket. She remembered his hollow eyes when she'd handed him her sandwich, the way he'd hesitated before accepting it, as if kindness from a stranger was something foreign, something he couldn't quite trust. "Is he okay?" Emily asked, her voice trembling with genuine worry. She could still see Tyler's pale face, the way his hand shook as he took the food. He'd looked so fragile, so hungry, like a bird too weak to fly. Corporal Diaz nodded, a faint smile breaking through his stern demeanor. "He is now, thanks to you." After eating the sandwich, Tyler had found his way to the Marine recruiting office downtown, a place his uncle had once mentioned in passing. The recruiters, recognizing Colonel Connelly's name, had quickly contacted the base. Emily felt a wave of relief wash over her, but it was tinged with disbelief. Her sandwich, half a turkey on rye, nothing special, had been enough to guide a lost boy to safety? Sergeant Reeves reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn photograph, its edges softened from years of handling. He handed it to Emily with a reverence that made her pause. "Colonel Connelly asked us to show you this," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a message delivered with purpose. The photo captured a moment from 2010 during the colonel's second deployment to Afghanistan. In it, a group of Marines stood proudly beside a newly built school, surrounded by children clutching books and supplies, their faces lit with tentative hope. Reeves cleared his throat and recited the colonel's words. "A child remembers kindness, and a unit never forgets." Emily's eyes lingered on the image, her heart swelling with a mix of awe and humility. She could almost feel the dust of that faraway place, the laughter of the children, the quiet pride of the Marines who'd built something lasting amid chaos. Reeves continued, explaining that Colonel Connelly had spent his career balancing combat with compassion, building schools, and delivering aid in war-torn regions. To him, small acts of kindness, like a sandwich shared with a hungry boy, held more power than grand gestures. They were the threads that wove humanity together, the quiet moments that defined who you were when the world wasn't watching. Emily's father, standing nearby, stepped forward, his voice thick with emotion. "My daughter's always been like that," he said, his eyes glistening with pride. "She sees the people others overlook." His words wrapped around Emily like a warm blanket, grounding her in a moment that felt both surreal and deeply real. Corporal Miller nodded, his gaze fixed on Emily. "Tyler told us that when everyone else turned away, you were the only one who saw him as a person, not a problem." His voice cracked slightly, and Emily felt her throat tighten. "He said he was ready to give up hope when you gave him that sandwich. It wasn't just food, it was a lifeline." Emily shifted uncomfortably, her cheeks flushing. "It was just half a sandwich," she murmured, almost to herself. Sergeant Reeves met her eyes, his expression gentle but firm. "Sometimes that's all it takes." Tyler hadn't eaten in nearly 24 hours. He was cold, scared, and starting to make desperate choices. Your kindness gave him the strength to keep going, to find help. As the Marines prepared to leave, Reeves handed Emily an envelope and made his movements deliberate. "Colonel Connelly will arrive tomorrow and wants to thank you in person," he said. "He asked us to give you this. It's not much, but it carries the gratitude of our entire unit." Emily took the envelope with trembling hands, her mind still reeling from the weight of their words. After the Marines left, she sat alone in her quiet living room, the envelope resting in her lap like a fragile treasure. When she finally opened it, she found a handwritten note from Colonel Connelly and a Marine Corps challenge coin. its weight solid and cool in her palm. The note was simple, its words etched into her heart. Some heroes wear factory uniforms. Thank you for seeing my nephew. Emily's breath caught as she read it, tears prickling her eyes. She traced the coin's edges, feeling the gravity of a gesture rarely extended to civilians. That night, sleep eluded her. Her mind replayed the Marine's visit, the photograph, the story of Tyler, a boy who'd lost so much, yet found his way because of her small act. She wondered about his future, about the uncle who'd built schools in war zones, about the weight of loss and hope tangled in their story. By morning, she'd almost convinced herself it was a dream, until her eyes landed on the challenge coin glinting on her nightstand, its presence grounding her in reality. At work, Emily arrived early, hoping to slip into her routine unnoticed. The factory's hum of machinery was familiar, comforting, but her thoughts were elsewhere. The sandwich incident felt trivial compared to Tyler's ordeal, and she doubted Supervisor Mason would understand. She kept her head down, focusing on her assembly tasks, but whispers rippled through the factory floor by 8:30 a.m. Heads turned as the front door swung open, and three Marines, Miller, Reeves, and Diaz, marched in with the same precision as the night before. With them was a fourth man, older, his colonel's eagles gleaming on his uniform. Colonel Connelly's presence filled the lobby with an unspoken authority, his weathered face carrying the weight of years spent leading and serving. The receptionist stood, flustered. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" as she asked, her voice uncertain. Colonel Connelly's response was calm but commanding. "We're here to speak with the factory management and Supervisor Mason. It concerns an incident involving one of your employees." The general manager arrived minutes later, his expression a mix of confusion and concern as he faced the unexpected military presence. After brief introductions, the group was ushered into the conference room, with Mason summoned shortly after. The factory buzzed with speculation, workers stealing glances and murmuring theories. Emily kept her focus on her work, though her heart pounded. She couldn't help but overhear the whispers, wondering what the Marines had come to say, and what it meant for the boy who'd eaten her sandwich by the fence. Emily Harper felt the weight of curious gazes as she moved through the factory floor, her work apron slightly wrinkled from the morning's tasks. She caught Diane's glance from across the break room, a flicker of intrigue in her coworker's eyes that made Emily's stomach twist with unease. During the morning break, Diane sidled up to her, her voice low and conspiratorial. "Hey, Emily, any idea why there are Marines in the conference room with Mason and the big shots?" Her tone carried a mix of curiosity and insistence, as if she sensed a story brewing. Emily hesitated, her mind racing back to the previous day, a fleeting moment of compassion that now felt like a stone lodged in her chest. "I might," she replied softly, her words cautious, as if speaking too loudly might unravel something fragile. Diane leaned closer, her eyes narrowing. "Is it about that kid Yun helped yesterday?" Before Emily could respond, the factory intercom crackled to life, its sharp static slicing through the hum of the break room. "Emily Harper to the conference room, please." The words hung in the air like a verdict. A hush fell over the break area, the clatter of coffee mugs and murmured conversations fading as every pair of eyes turned to her. Emily stood slowly, her hands smoothing her apron in a reflexive attempt to steady herself. Her heart thudded as she crossed the factory floor, each step echoing in her mind like a drumbeat. She could feel the weight of her coworkers' stares, their unspoken questions trailing her like shadows toward the administrative wing. Inside the conference room, Emily was met with a scene that felt both surreal and intimidating. Supervisor Mason sat rigidly, his face flushed a deep red, his eyes locked on the table as if it held answers he couldn't face. Flanking him were the general manager and the human resources director, their expressions heavy with a gravity that made Emily's pulse quicken. Across from them stood four Marines, their postures impeccable, their uniforms crisp and commanding. At their center was Colonel Mark Connelly, his presence dominating the room not through force, but through a quiet, unyielding authority. His face, etched with deep laugh lines around kind yet piercing eyes, defied the stern military stereotype Emily had expected. "Miss Harper," the general manager said, his voice steady but tinged with discomfort as he gestured to an empty chair. "Please join us." Emily sat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her mind a whirlwind of uncertainty. Why was she here? What could this possibly mean? Colonel Connelly stepped forward, his gaze meeting hers with a warmth that contrasted his formal bearing. "Miss Harper, I'm Colonel Mark Connelly," he began, his voice calm but resolute. "My nephew Tyler is safe at the base now, thanks in large part to the kindness you showed him yesterday." Emily nodded, her throat tight. She remembered Tyler, a small, hungry boy with wary eyes, standing alone outside the factory. She'd given him a sandwich from her lunch, a simple act that had felt instinctive, human. But it had led to a written warning from Mason, a reprimand for breaking protocol. Now, as she sat in this room, surrounded by authority figures, she felt a mix of relief and apprehension. Why did her small gesture warrant this formal gathering? Colonel Connelly's expression grew serious, though his eyes remained kind. "I've explained to your management the circumstances of Tyler's situation and the role you played in helping him find his way back to family. What troubles me, and what brought me here today, is learning that you were disciplined for that act of compassion." His words landed like a quiet thunderclap, and Emily's breath caught. She glanced at Mason, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his flush deepening. The general manager cleared his throat, his voice measured but apologetic. "Miss Harper, we owe you an apology for how yesterday's situation was handled. Had we known the full context—" "With respect, sir," Colonel Connelly interrupted, his tone even but firm, "the context shouldn't matter. Basic human decency, especially toward a hungry child, shouldn't require special circumstances to be acceptable in your workplace." His words carried the weight of a man who had seen too much to tolerate excuses. Mason squirmed, his discomfort palpable. "We have security protocols," he muttered, his voice defensive. Colonel Connelly's gaze didn't waver. "I understand security concerns better than most. I've commanded security details in active war zones. What happened yesterday wasn't a security breach. It was a failure of compassion." His voice was steady, but the rebuke was unmistakable, and Emily felt a strange mix of vindication and awe. This man, a stranger, was defending her in a way she hadn't dared hope for. The Human Resources Director spoke up, her tone conciliatory. "We've already removed the written warning from Miss Harper's file, and we'll be reviewing our policies regarding community interactions to prevent this in the future." Emily sat in stunned silence, her mind struggling to process the surreal turn of events. For 5 years, she had navigated the factory's rigid hierarchy, keeping her head down, doing her job. Now, in the span of a morning, that hierarchy seemed to bend under the quiet authority of Colonel Connelly and his Marines. The meeting continued, but Emily's thoughts drifted to Tyler, to the sandwich, to the fleeting moment when she'd seen gratitude in his eyes. She hadn't expected it to lead here, to this room, to this moment where her simple act was being championed by a man who commanded respect without raising his voice. By lunchtime, the factory was abuzz with whispers. Word of the Marines' visit had spread like wildfire. A worker from shipping had recorded their arrival, 4 figures in crisp uniforms striding through the factory's entrance, and posted the clip to the local workers' social media group with the caption, "Marines came to thank someone for a sandwich. What did we miss?" The video sparked a frenzy of speculation, and by mid-afternoon, the story had reached the local newspaper. A reporter called the factory, piecing together fragments of the incident until a headline emerged. "Factory worker disciplined for helping hungry child. Marines intervene." The public response was swift and overwhelming. The factory's social media accounts were inundated with comments, most condemning the initial discipline and praising Emily's kindness. Some called for Mason's resignation. Others demanded policy changes. The company's regional director, rattled by the growing scrutiny, called an emergency meeting with management to address the fallout. Inside the factory, Emily found herself at the center of an unexpected shift. Co-workers who had barely acknowledged her in 5 years now stopped by her station, offering quiet words of support or shy smiles. Even Diane, who had cautioned her against helping Tyler, approached with a sheepish expression. "I wish I'd had your courage," she admitted, her voice tinged with regret. Emily nodded, unsure how to respond. She wasn't used to being seen, let alone celebrated. As her shift ended at 4:30 p.m., Emily was startled to find Colonel Connelly waiting in the lobby. His uniform was as crisp as it had been that morning, but his demeanor was softer, almost personal. "I hope you don't mind my waiting," he said, his voice gentle. "I wanted to speak with you away from all the formalities." Emily's heart skipped a beat, but she nodded, following him across the street to a small park where a familiar figure sat on a bench. Tyler, now clean and dressed in fresh clothes, looked up as they approached. His expression was still solemn, but there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes. "Uncle Mark says you're the sandwich lady," he said, his voice small but clear. Emily smiled, warmth spreading through her despite the cool evening air. "I guess I am." "Thank you," Tyler said simply, his words carrying a weight that made Emily's chest tighten. "Nobody else even looked at me." Colonel Connelly placed a hand on his nephew's shoulder, his touch steady and protective. "Tyler will be coming to live with me and my family at Camp Leon. We've expedited the guardianship paperwork." "I'm glad," Emily said, her voice sincere. She looked at Tyler, imagining the safety and stability he'd find with his uncle. "He deserves a good home." "Miss Harper, Emily," Colonel Connelly said, his tone softening further. "Your kindness made a difference. Not just for Tyler, but for everyone who's heard this story. Don't ever doubt that." His words lingered, a quiet affirmation that settled deep within her, easing the lingering doubts she'd carried since the reprimand. As she walked back to her peignoir, the weight of the day felt lighter, replaced by a quiet pride she hadn't known she could feel. In a quiet, unassuming factory town, a single act of compassion rippled through lives, reshaping perspectives and mending broken spirits. To Emily Harper, her gesture might have seemed trivial, a fleeting moment of humanity. But to Tyler, a boy grappling with unimaginable loss, it was a beacon of light in a world that had crumbled around him. Orphaned by his mother's death, Tyler found himself adrift in an unfamiliar place, his heart heavy with fear and loneliness. The warmth of Emily's kindness, offered without hesitation, became the first thread of normalcy in his unraveling life. It was a moment that whispered to him that he wasn't entirely alone, that someone still saw him. That day, as Emily sat in the factory break room, her phone vibrated with an unexpected message from her father. "Turn on Channel 5 News. You're on it." Her heart skipped a beat, a mix of confusion and curiosity swirling within her. The local evening news had caught wind of her story, weaving together accounts from factory workers about a Marine's visit and the incident that followed. Without security footage, they pieced together the tale of the sandwich Emily had given Tyler, portraying her as a modern-day hero who stood against the cold indifference of corporate rules. The narrative painted her as a quiet rebel, a woman who chose compassion over compliance. For Emily, the sudden spotlight felt surreal, almost overwhelming. She hadn't set out to be a hero. She'd simply seen a hungry, scared boy and acted on instinct. By the next morning, the story had taken on a life of its own. Supervisor Mason, whose rigid enforcement of rules had sparked the moment, was placed on administrative leave pending a review. Emily received a formal apology from the company president, a gesture that felt both sincere and calculated. The factory, eager to mend its tarnished image, announced a new community outreach program in partnership with local food banks. Though the move reeked of damage control, Emily couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope that it might do some good. Her thoughts, however, lingered on Tyler. She wondered how he was faring, whether that brief moment of a connection had meant as much to him as it had begun to mean to her. 2 weeks later, Emily found herself at the heart of the town's annual Veterans Appreciation Ceremony, an event she'd never imagined attending, let alone being honored at. The mayor presented her with a Citizen of Quiet Honor certificate, his words praising her selflessness. Nearby, Colonel Connelly and his Marine unit stood at attention, their presence a silent tribute to her courage. Emily's chest tightened with a mix of pride and unease. She wasn't used to being seen. Not like this. Then Tyler appeared, now enrolled in the Young Marines program at Camp Lejeune, having returned for the ceremony. When he was called to the stage, he didn't hesitate. He walked straight to Emily and wrapped his arms around her waist, his small frame trembling with emotion. "I ate your sandwich and believed my mom was still watching over me," he whispered, his voice barely audible but piercing her heart. Tears welled in Emily's eyes as she held him close, feeling the weight of his words. The crowd fell silent, the soft hum of applause filling the air as onlookers watched, some wiping their own eyes. For Emily, the moment was raw, sacred, a reminder that her simple act had touched a soul in ways she couldn't have foreseen. As she stepped off the stage, Emily's gaze drifted to the back of the crowd, where Supervisor Mason stood. Their eyes met for a fleeting second before his dropped, a shadow of shame or perhaps regret crossing his face. Emily felt no surge of victory, no desire to gloat. Instead, a quiet hope stirred within her. Maybe, just maybe, he'd learned to see people differently. She carried no resentment, only a wish for change, for a world where compassion didn't need to fight to be heard. Later that evening, as the ceremony drew to a close, Colonel Connelly approached her again. His presence was steady, commanding, yet his eyes held a warmth that put her at ease. "You know what's remarkable?" he said, his voice low but firm. "Marines train for years to find the courage to run toward danger when others flee. You showed that same courage, Emily, just by following your heart when everyone else turned away." Emily shook her head, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "It was just a sandwich," she murmured, almost embarrassed by the praise. The colonel's smile deepened. "It's never just a sandwich, Emily. It's a reminder that even in our darkest moments, someone sees us. Sometimes that's enough to guide us home." His words settled into her, heavy with truth, and for the first time, she allowed herself to feel the magnitude of what she'd done, not for the applause, but for the boy whose life had shifted because of it. 6 months later, Emily still worked at Eagle Line Steel, but the factory felt different now, as though her actions had left an indelible mark. The company had launched Lunch with Honor, a program partnering with local schools to support children in need. As the employee representative, Emily poured her heart into coordinating monthly food drives and mentorship opportunities. Each event filled her with quiet pride, knowing she was helping others find the kind of support Tyler had needed. Supervisor Mason never returned to his role. After the company's review, he was reassigned to a non-supervisory position at another facility. His replacement, a former military veteran, brought a new approach, one that balanced security with empathy. Emily admired her, sensing a shared belief in seeing people's second chances. Every month, Emily made the 2-hour drive to Camp Lejeune to visit Tyler. Their bond, unlikely yet unbreakable, had grown into something profound. Tyler called her Miss E, a nickname that made her heart glow. He'd show her his progress in the Young Marines program, his confidence blossoming with each achievement. Though the scars of his mother's death and his time on the streets lingered, Tyler was finding his way, supported by his uncle's family and Emily's steadfast presence. During one visit, as they sat under the same oak tree where they'd first talked, Tyler looked at her with earnest eyes. "You didn't just give me food, Missy. You gave me hope." Emily's breath caught, and she squeezed his hand, unable to find words that matched the depth of her feelings. Back at the factory, the lunchbox Emily had used that fateful day was now displayed in a small glass case near the entrance. A plaque beside it reading, "Kindness needs no permission, only a heart." New employees heard the story during orientation, a tale that had become part of the company's evolving culture. Emily found it strange to be the center of such a legacy, but she accepted it with grace, knowing it wasn't about her. It was about the change it inspired. At a community outreach event, a young factory worker approached Emily, her voice tentative but curious. "Weren't you scared of losing your job, Damon?" she asked, echoing a question many had thought but few had voiced. Emily paused, her mind drifting back to that moment in the break room. "I was scared," she admitted, her voice soft but honest. "But I was more afraid of what might happen to Tyler if I looked away. Sometimes you have to risk everything, fear itself, to do what's right." Her answer, simple yet powerful, became a quiet motto she carried with her. Despite the recognition, Emily remained the same, modest, diligent, and deeply compassionate, a woman whose courage had sparked a movement without ever seeking the spotlight. On the anniversary of the day that would forever be known as the Sandwich Incident, Colonel Connelly, a man whose stern demeanor hid a heart softened by years of witnessing both valor and vulnerability, orchestrated an evening that would etch itself into the memories of all who attended. He had arranged for Emily, a factory worker whose quiet courage had rippled far beyond her modest circumstances, to be the guest of honor at a Marine Corps Charitable Foundation dinner. The grand ballroom was a sea of crisp dress blues, gleaming medals, and the polished elegance of civic leaders. Their faces a mix of curiosity and respect as they gathered to hear from a woman who, by all accounts, was an unlikely centerpiece for such an occasion. Emily stood at the podium, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped its edges, not from fear, but from the weight of the moment. Her heart raced with a blend of pride and disbelief. She, a woman who spent her days in the rhythmic hum of eagle-line steel, was now addressing a room of heroes and dignitaries. The spotlight warmed her face, but it was the attentive silence of the crowd that steadied her. She took a deep breath, her thoughts drifting to that fateful day when a simple gesture had altered the course of her life and so many others. "A sandwich can't feed the world," she began, her voice soft but resonant, cutting through the stillness like a gentle wave. "But sometimes it's enough to restore faith." Her words carried the weight of her own journey. Emily thought of the exhaustion that had once clung to her like a shadow, the endless shifts at the factory, the ache in her hands from hours of repetitive work. She remembered the hunger, not just for food but for hope, on that day when a stranger's kindness had offered her more than just sustenance. It had given her a spark, a reminder that even in the grind of daily survival, humanity could still shine through. "Kindness doesn't need to be grand," she continued, her eyes scanning the room, meeting the gazes of men and women who had seen war, loss, and triumph. "It just needs to be timely and unhesitating." Her voice grew stronger, infused with the conviction of someone who had lived the truth of her words. She spoke not as a performer, but as a woman who had felt the transformative power of a single, selfless act. The room was captivated, not by eloquence, but by authenticity. Each person present seemed to drift into their own memories, recalling moments when a small gesture, a kind word, a helping hand, had shifted something deep within them. For the Marines, it was a reminder that their sacrifices, often cloaked in the grandeur of duty, were rooted in the same quiet humanity Emily embodied. For the civic leaders, it was a humbling pause, a chance to reflect on the power they held to uplift or ignore. As Emily neared the end of her speech, her gaze settled on the rows of Marines, their dress blues a striking contrast to the worn coveralls she wore at the factory. She thought of the countless days she'd walk past the steel benches outside Eagle Line, never imagining one would one day bear words inspired by her. "Honor doesn't always wear a uniform," she said, her voice steady now, carrying a quiet fire. "Sometimes it wears a factory worker's clothes." She paused, letting the words settle, feeling the truth of them in her bones. Just one small act of kindness can change a terrible day, a life, and sometimes even the world. The room erupted in applause, not the polite kind, but the kind that comes from hearts stirred and perspectives shifted. Emily stepped back from the podium, her cheeks flushed with a mix of relief and gratitude. She thought of the stranger who had given her that sandwich, unaware that their simple act would lead to this moment, to words that would later be carved into a bench outside Eagle Line steel, a permanent testament to the power of compassion. As she returned to her seat, the weight of the evening settled over her, not heavy, but warm, like a blanket woven from the shared humanity of everyone in the room. The Marines, some with eyes glistening, exchanged nods, their thoughts turning to comrades they'd lost or lives they'd touched in ways they'd never fully know. The civic leaders, usually so composed, leaned toward one another, whispering about how they might carry Emily's message into their own work. For Emily, the night was more than an honor. It was a reminder of her own strength, a strength she hadn't always recognized in herself. She felt connected to something larger, a thread of kindness that stretched from that one sandwich to this room and beyond, a legacy that would endure long after the applause faded.